The September drizzle, a fine, persistent mist that seeped into the very marrow of things, carried with it the acrid, cloying scent of wet pine needles. Beneath that, sharper, more unsettling, was the ammonia tang of dog, a smell so potent it was a physical presence. This was the welcome Jonathan Marlowe received as his old pickup truck, a dented Ford vehicle with more rust than paint, sputtered into the outskirts of a small, nondescript town nestled deep in the forgotten hollows of Maine. He had not chosen the town for its charm. There was none. He had chosen it because it was distant, quiet, and offered the kind of work that demanded physical exertion but spared the mind. It was a place where thoughts, particularly the unwelcome ones, would finally be drowned out by the grind of honest labor. He had found the job listing in a ragged newspaper, tucked between ads for used tractors and local church bake sales. Animal caretaker needed, overnight and day shifts. Experience preferred but not essential. The last chance animal shelter, it said. The name settled on him with a grim irony. His first shift began on a Tuesday, a morning choked with fog so thick it was like breathing underwater. The world was a muted canvas of grays and greens, the sun a pale, indistinct disk somewhere beyond the veil. The shelter itself appeared through the swirling mist as a spectral presence from an industrial past. A long, low-slung building of cinder blocks and corrugated metal, painted a faded battleship gray. It was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with 3 strands of barbed wire that glinted dully with moisture, a detail Jonathan knew was excessive for a typical dog pound. The air was heavy, damp, tasting faintly of metal and something else, something undefinable, like stale breath. What struck him most, the first thing that snagged his attention and tugged at the frayed edges of his composure, was the silence. A dog shelter, he thought, should be a cacophony of barks, yelps, and frantic greetings. Here there was none of that chaotic clamor. Instead, a low infrasound rumble vibrated through the ground, a synchronized guttural thrum that emanated from every kennel at once. It was not a growl, not precisely, but a collective exhalation, a sound that was a carefully orchestrated signal, not an animal expression. He walked closer, the crunch of his boots on the gravel path the loudest sound in the unnaturally quiet space, and peering through the mesh of the kennels, he saw them. They were large, these dogs. They resembled mastiffs or oversized shepherds in bulk and power, yet they were like no breed he could identify. Their coats were uniformly dense and dark, shades of charcoal and deep, wet loam. Their musculature, even when they lay coiled in slumber or sat perfectly still, was formidable, rippling beneath the thick fur in a way that spoke of immense contained power. But it was their eyes that held him. Without exception, their eyes were the same deep, luminous amber, like fossilized honey or polished obsidian catching the last rays of a dying sun. They were too still, too uniform, too knowing. The first task of his shift was cleaning the kennels. He donned thick work gloves, the kind with reinforced palms, and pushed a heavy wheelbarrow through the narrow aisle between the rows of cages. As he scooped the damp straw and waste, the dogs watched him. He reached into one cage to gather a particularly stubborn pile, and his hand brushed against a dark flank. The fur was incredibly dense, like felted wool, and beneath it the flesh was extraordinarily warm, even greasy, like heated leather. But it was not the warmth, or even the surprising density, that unnerved him. It was the quality of the muscle underneath. not the familiar give and flex of animal tissue, but a preternatural solidity, a too firm, almost metallic resistance. He felt the sensation of touching a tightly packed spring steel mechanism rather than living sinew. The smell, too, intensified inside the cages. Wet earth, damp fur, and that thin, puzzling metallic tang in the air, like old pennies or rusty blood. A spectral odor clinging to the concrete and the very breath of the animals. During feeding, the unsettling observations continued. He approached a kennel where a female, a particularly magnificent creature with a coat the color of scorched earth, sat patiently. Her tag, small and simple, read Kara. He knelt to place her bowl, and as he straightened, his eyes met hers. It was not the expectant, slightly frantic gaze of a hungry dog. It was not begging, nor aggression, nor even simple curiosity. It was an assessing look, too prolonged, too considered. Her amber eyes held a depth he could not fathom, a human intelligence that watched him without the slightest flicker of canine emotion. She did not sniff the food or wag her tail. She simply observed, her gaze cool and unnervingly direct. He moved on. The image of those eyes burned into his mind. As he secured the heavy latch on Kara's kennel, he noted again the construction of the entire facility. The chain-link fence was not just tall. It was sunk deep into the earth, its posts concreted with military precision. The locks on the main gate and the larger kennel sections were new, massive steel mechanisms, glinting with fresh lubricant. This was not a fence to keep dogs in, he realized with a prickle of unease. It was a fence designed to keep something, or someone, out. The entire complex was a small, isolated fortress, not an animal shelter. Later that afternoon, a fleeting moment solidified his growing disquiet. He was attempting to lead a large male, whose amber eyes gleamed with a particularly fierce intensity, back into his run. Remembering an old training trick, Jonathan tried a firm, low command. Sit. The dog stared at him, unmoving, its ears barely twitching. Jonathan tried again, this time changing his intonation, lowering his voice further, lending it a tone of quiet, absolute authority, the kind of subtle dominance a drill sergeant might employ. The animal did not react to the word itself, but to the sudden shift in sound. Its body tensed, and with a startling abruptness, a sudden frightened jerk, it dropped to a sitting position. It was not obedience. It was a reflex. The specific frequency or timbre of his voice triggered a deeply ingrained primal response, bypassing the intellectual understanding of language altogether. As the sun, a weak and watery orange by then, began its descent, Jonathan finished his first shift. He secured the last of the outside gates, the heavy steel bar thudding into place, followed by the definitive clack of the massive padlock. He felt a profound weariness, but it was not the familiar ache of physical labor. It was a sensory exhaustion, a profound fatigue that settled deep within his bones. Too many strange smells, too many unsettling sounds, and most of all, too many other eyes. Eyes that watched, assessed, and held a knowledge far beyond what any animal should possess. As the final lock clicked shut behind him, the sound was heavy and resonant, carrying with it a sense of finality that settled like a stone in his stomach. He was outside, but the feeling lingered. He had just spent 8 hours in a place where the ordinary had begun its slow, inexorable slide into something utterly, chillingly else. The days began to fold into a predictable, monotonous sequence, each one a carbon copy of the last, save for the subtle, unsettling changes that Jonathan Marlowe could not define, yet felt with increasing certainty in the pit of his stomach. The initial strangeness of the shelter, which he had rationalized as the eccentricities of rural animal care, had calcified into something more sinister. He noticed that the pervading calm of the place was not natural. It was unnatural, a strained, forced tranquility. The dogs were not simply calm, they were waiting. Their stillness was not peace. It was an active state of alert, an unnerving patience. The shelter, he knew, was situated on the edge of a dense forest, miles from the nearest highway. In a place like this, he expected to hear the rustle of leaves, the distant caw of a crow, the faint hum of a far-off truck. But there was nothing. No birdsong, no distant traffic, just an oppressive, all-encompassing acoustic stillness. It was broken only by that low infrasound hum that occasionally emanated from the kennels. It was not a sound one heard with the ears, not really, but felt in the chest, a deep vibration that resonated through the concrete floor and up into his feet. It happened most often when all the animals, in a chilling display of unified focus, would simultaneously look in a single direction, their amber eyes fixed on a point in the distance that Jonathan could not discern. They collectively received a signal, an instruction, watching for something only they could perceive. One morning, as he cleaned Kara's kennel, the light from the overhead fluorescent tube glinted off something on her left front paw. He knelt, his gloved hand reaching out, and gently lifted the dense fur. There, just above the wrist, was a scar. It was old, faded to a silvery white against her dark skin, but its outline was unmistakably clean. Not the jagged, torn mark of an injury sustained in a fight, or from scrambling through barbed wire. No, this was a healed incision, long and remarkably straight. It was made by a surgeon's scalpel, a very sharp, very precise knife. It was a detail that pulsed with a quiet wrongness, a detail that screamed of premeditation rather than accident. He felt a cold dread begin to coil in his gut. And that metallic smell. It was not always present, but it surfaced most strongly when he was scrubbing down the concrete floors or hosing out a particularly soiled kennel. It reminded him of blood, yes, but not fresh, vibrant blood. This was drier, more technical, like the scent of old iron or the humid air around a rusting engine. It was not emanating from the animals themselves, at least not directly. The smell had absorbed into the very fabric of the building, soaked into the porous concrete and sealed within the painted cinder block walls, a phantom presence that underscored the surgical neatness of Kara's scar. During the designated exercise time in the fenced-off yard, Jonathan often led a group of dogs out. One afternoon, he released 7 of them into the enclosure. They loped across the patchy grass, their powerful bodies moving with a fluid grace. But then, as one, they veered to the right. A moment later, they all stopped, their heads tilted simultaneously, their amber eyes fixed on something beyond the fence. Then, in a terrifying display of synchronicity, they began to run again. Their turns, their accelerations, their very breaths happening as if they were a single, multi-limbed organism. It was not the chaotic, joyous energy of a pack at play. It was drilled, practiced, robotic. It was the movement of a perfectly coordinated unit, a single mind animating 7 distinct bodies. The sight sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. Later that week, a large male, a black-coated brute with a perpetually low growl, developed a limp. Jonathan called for a veterinarian. Dr. Airy, a thin, middle-aged woman with perpetually tired eyes, arrived in a beat-up Ford sedan that dated back to the early 90s. She examined the dog, muttering about a strained muscle. Jonathan watched her, trying to glean more. She gave him the usual veterinary platitudes about the breed being prone to such injuries. But as she drew a blood sample, he caught a flicker of something in her eyes, a fleeting look of anxiety that she quickly suppressed. As she packed her instruments, she said, her voice unusually quiet, a whisper, "Their blood, you know. It's thick. Too thick. Like old oil." She said it as an observation, laden with unspoken concern, a detail out of place in the mundane world of veterinary medicine. Then came the owners. These were the most unsettling visits of all. They arrived in sleek, dark cars, always after dusk, always alone. They were pale, these people, with a gauntness that stole the light from their faces. Their lips were thin, identical in their precise, unsmiling line. Their features were so unremarkable, so perfectly average, that Jonathan found them incredibly difficult to remember once they were out of sight. They stood by the kennel, silent and still. The dog they came for, and it was always one dog at a time, did not bark with joy or leap with excitement. Instead, it would cringe, pressing itself against the back of the cage, then slowly, submissively, crawl forward to them, its head bowed in a pose of utter, absolute submission. There was no affection, no human-animal bond he could discern. Just a cold transaction, a transfer of property. And always the dogs left with those identical expressionless people vanishing into the inky blackness of the Maine night. Lying in his cot that night, the cheap springs groaning beneath him, Jonathan Marlowe found himself in the throes of an internal monologue, a battle between what his senses were screaming and what his rational mind desperately clung to. He was a former United States Marine, a man forged in the crucible of logic and hard reality. He trusted facts, blueprints, and verifiable data. But his body, his very being, was betraying him. His nose screamed of metallic blood smells in a place where none existed. His eyes cried out against amber uniformity and surgical scars. His ears protested the infrasound hum and the chilling synchronicity. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a terrifying realization that his own perceptions were challenged and eroded by something beyond the pale. He told himself it was just strange dogs, an odd veterinarian, peculiar owners, the quirks of a backwoods town. But his body, his gut, his primal animal instinct shrieked that this was not just dogs. This was something else entirely. And the thought, once admitted, began to carve out a dark, permanent space within his mind. The rain started that night. A slow, insistent drumming on the tin roof of the shelter, carrying a chill that seeped through the walls and straight into Jonathan Marlowe's bones. The atmosphere inside the long, gray building thickened, growing heavy with the humidity and the smell of wet earth. The meager light from the flickering fluorescent tubes cast long, dancing shadows that clung to the corners, and an unnerving feeling began to take root in Jonathan's mind. The walls of the shelter were not just enclosing space. They were listening. He was on the night shift, a role he had picked up after the owner had offered extra hours, her pale face impassive. The storm had caused a brownout, and the electricity, already unreliable, began to pulse and flicker, plunging the kennels into momentary darkness before sputtering back to a weak yellow glow. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight, its beam a stark, artificial sun in the gloom, Jonathan began his rounds. The low hum he had become accustomed to was gone, replaced by the relentless hiss of the rain and the rhythmic drip of a leak somewhere near the main office. As he walked past the cages, his beam cutting through the gloom, he heard a sound. A faint, grating scrape like metal on concrete, followed by a soft, rustling shh. He paused, his heart giving a small, unwelcome jump. He swung the beam of his flashlight towards the sound, and it landed on Kara's kennel. She was not lying down, was not even sitting. She was standing on her hind legs, pressed against the vertical bars of her cage. Her dark, powerful body was elongated, gaunt in the stark light, and her amber eyes glowed with an unnerving intensity. Her front paws, which he had always assumed were paws, were not resting on the bars in a typical canine fashion. No, they were grasping them. His breath hitched in his throat. As his beam held steady, he saw it. One of her paws was reaching for the heavy steel latch of her kennel door. It was not a paw at all, not in the way he understood it. The thick, dark fur on the limb had receded and thinned, revealing patches of pale white skin beneath. And what he saw was not a paw, but a finger-like appendage, unnaturally long and slender, tipped with a hard, flat nail. It was manipulating the bolt, not with the clumsy curiosity of an animal, but with a precise, skilled, purposeful movement, attempting to slide the heavy mechanism open. The sight struck him with the force of a physical blow, punching the air from his lungs. This was not a dog. This was something that imitated a dog, and it was trying to escape its prison with intelligent, dexterous intent. The moment Kara saw the direct glare of the flashlight, the focused beam illuminating her unnatural endeavor, she dropped. The movement was impossibly fast, a blur of dark fur. She collapsed onto all four legs, her body instantly assuming the familiar bulky posture of a large dog. But the sound of her descent, that sudden jarring impact on the concrete, was wrong. It was too quick, too sharp. There was a faint, wet crunch of joints, a sound like dry branches snapping underfoot, but magnified, accelerated, her skeletal structure undergoing a rapid, violent realignment. She lay still then, her amber eyes fixed on him, nothing more than a large, frightened animal caught in a forbidden act. But Jonathan knew. He had seen. Throughout the rest of his rounds, and even into the next day's shift, Jonathan could not shake the pervasive feeling that he was being scrutinized, not just by Kara, but by all of them. He felt it on his back, a prickling sensation that made the hairs on his neck stand up. He spun around, flashlight sweeping the empty aisle, or his eyes darting to the rows of silent kennels, only to find nothing but the placid, unblinking stares of amber eyes. It was a phantom touch, an omnipresent awareness. His every movement, his very presence was felt and measured. And beneath his boots, the cold concrete floor of the shelter now emitted a faint, unsettling warmth. It was the pervasive, barely perceptible heat of something alive stirring just beneath the surface. Not residual heat. Driven by an unconscious need for precision, a desperate attempt to ground himself in the measurable and the real, Jonathan found himself taking out his tape measure. He meticulously measured the distance between the steel bars of the kennels, the thickness of the concrete walls, the height of the chain-link fence. The results only deepened his unease. Everything was too sturdy, too over-engineered. The bars were thicker than necessary. The concrete walls reinforced beyond standard construction. The fence posts sunk deeper, wider. This was not just a shelter. It was a containment facility, a purpose-built structure designed with an unyielding strength to hold something far more dangerous than stray dogs. He talked to the other employees, the pale, quiet figures who drifted through their shifts with a resigned air. They were mostly older, their faces etched with a weariness that went beyond mere fatigue. When he tentatively brought up the subject of the strange night movements or the unusual silence of the dogs, they grew nervous, their eyes darting away. After sunset, one of the older women, her voice thin as parchment, mumbled, "We do not walk them. It's the rule." She said it not as an explanation, but as a mantra, a deeply ingrained prohibition that tolerated no questioning. Their silence, their quiet apprehension, spoke volumes. The final chilling detail of that unsettling period came on Jonathan's next morning shift. He was doing a head count, matching the dogs in the kennels to the entries in the thick logbook. He stopped at a cage number 23. A large brindle male, he had fed it just yesterday, had even briefly, foolishly, attempted to teach it to sit with his new, specific intonation. The cage was clean, freshly hosed, meticulously prepared for a new occupant. But it was empty. He flipped through the logbook, his finger tracing down the entries. There, beside number 23, was a neatly penned note. Transferred to owner. No name, no address, no date, just the curt, formal phrase. No goodbyes, no happy reunion barks, no faint scent of dog lingering in the straw. Just a pristine, chilling emptiness. It was not an escape. It was a disappearance, a systematic removal. The dog was simply gone, vanished without a trace, leaving only a void where it once lay. The accumulated tension, a slow-burning fuse Jonathan Marlowe had tamped down, finally erupted into a terrifying, undeniable truth one rain-soaked night. He knew he must not stay. The rational part of his brain, the part that had served him through tours of duty, screamed at him to clock out, get in his truck, and drive until the Maine coastline became a distant memory. But the other part, the nascent, terrified curiosity that had begun to blossom in the dark corners of his mind, held him captive. He had to know. Instead of leaving, he punched out on the time clock, then circled around the back using the dense thicket of soaking pines for cover, and slipped back into the deserted shelter. He found a precarious hiding spot behind a towering stack of kibble sacks in the farthest corner of the main kennel aisle, the dry, dusty smell of dog food doing little to quell the metallic taste of fear already coating his tongue. The digital clock on the wall, a cheap plastic thing that glowed with an eerie green light, clicked over to 1 o'clock in the morning. That is when it started. The rumble of an engine, tires crunching on the wet gravel drive, echoed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. And then the dogs began to howl. It was not the mournful cry of separation or the sharp yelp of aggression he had heard from countless pound dogs. This was something else entirely. It began as individual cries, then quickly escalated, blending into a horrifying, seamless unison. A single, drawn-out, vibrating sound that was not quite a howl, not quite a roar, but something in between, a resonant tone that pressed not just on his eardrums, but on the very meaning of things, twisting the air and his perceptions into a sickening knot. It was a sound that did not just hurt. It profoundly unsettled, echoing through the bone. The heavy main door hissed open, allowing the cold, damp night air to rush in, carrying with it a faint, cloying scent of frost and something else, something sharp and ancient, like old metal that had known deep cold. Two figures entered, the owners. Jonathan could only see their silhouettes against the distant hazy light from the office. They were impossibly tall, their forms lean and skeletal. The shadows they cast on the cinder block wall were unnaturally long, stretching and distorting, their heads appearing strangely small and featureless, giving them the appearance of elongated, monstrous insects. They moved without a sound, their footsteps echoing with a subtle, unnerving weight. They moved directly to Kara's cage. She was already standing, her body trembling violently, her amber eyes wide and fixed on the two figures. They did not speak. They did not touch the heavy latch. They simply looked at her. And then the horror began. Kara started to shudder, a convulsive spasm that racked her entire frame. Jonathan could hear it, a sickening, wet, crunching sound, like dry bones snapping, only muffled, deep within her flesh. Her powerful body began to stretch, elongated, pulled from within by invisible wires. Her dark, dense fur, which he had once touched and found so warm and greasy, did not fall out. It began to recede, drawing back into her skin like liquid wax melting and flowing backwards, exposing the pale, translucent flesh beneath. The powerful snout drew back, the jawline altering, reshaping. In the dim, flickering light, before his horrified, disbelieving eyes, the form of the dog dissolved. In its place, where Kara had been, a woman stood. She was breathtakingly pale, her skin like alabaster, stretched taut over a delicate, fragile bone structure. Her limbs were impossibly long and slender, her fingers tapering into fine, elegant points. Her hair, what little there was a pale, silvery white. And her eyes, they were the same amber, burning with the familiar, unsettling glow. But now they held something new, something chilling, a profound animal, cold terror. It was not a human fear. It was something ancient, feral, a deep, primal horror that spoke of a creature trapped, broken, and profoundly, utterly alone. She was a human who had forgotten what it meant to be human, a spectral person imprisoned within the beast. The realization slammed into Jonathan with brutal force, tearing away the last vestiges of his rational mind. This was not a shelter. This was a farm. Not a refuge, but a control point, a processing station. The dogs were not just animals, they were lower shapeshifters held in a coercive animal form. And these owners, these pale, silent figures, were the higher ones, the overseers, using the transformed creatures as livestock and labor, ensuring they remained under strict supervision, never allowed to break free of their imposed forms. It was a terrifying, systematic mechanism of control. From the two figures, a sudden low dialogue drifted, their voices dry, academic, devoid of all emotion. Forms stabilized, not more than 7 hours in the cycle, otherwise risk of crossover, tissue degradation, loss of coherence. Jonathan strained to hear more, but the words were clipped, precise, technical. This was not magic, he realized with a fresh wave of dread. This was technology. This was biology. This was logic. A cold, terrifying, utterly inhuman logic applied to living beings. He could not move. His muscles were locked, his breath caught in his throat. His entire body was drenched in cold sweat, clinging to his skin like a second, clammy hide. He tasted it then, the familiar metallic tang. But this time it was not the phantom smell of concrete or old blood. It was his own fear, thick and viscous, a slow metallic burn on his tongue, mirroring the unusual thickness of the dog's blood that Dr. Airy had spoken of. He was trapped, a silent witness to an impossible reality, his own senses now irrevocably tainted by the unspeakable horror he had just seen unfold. The world had shifted on its axis, and he was left clinging to the wreckage of his sanity, utterly alone in the chilling reality of what this shelter truly was. Jonathan Marlowe left the shelter that night before dawn, his mind a fractured mosaic of terror and impossible truth. He did not use the main gate, instead scrambling over the back fence, tearing his jeans and scraping his hands on the barbed wire, hardly noticing the pain. He moved like an animal through the dense, dripping woods, the cold leaves slapping his face, the metallic tang of his own fear still raw on his tongue. He drove his old Ford pickup truck through the pre-dawn gloom, his hands clamped to the steering wheel, knuckles white, not knowing where he was going, only that he had to put miles between himself and what he had witnessed. But no matter how far he drove, the image of Kara's transformation, the wet crunch of bone, the receding fur, and those cold amber eyes of the woman who had once been a dog remained seared into his retina. He returned to the shelter the following morning. He had to. There was nowhere else to go, no one he could speak to, nothing to explain what he had seen. The world outside, the familiar, comforting world of logic and reason, had simply ceased to exist for him. He was no longer the same man who had clocked in for his first shift a few weeks ago. His rational mind had been shattered, replaced by a terrible, undeniable knowledge. As he walked through the main doors, everything looked as it had yesterday. The long, gray barracks, the rows of kennels, the piles of fresh straw. The dogs, those silent, watchful creatures, were back in their cages, their bodies coiled in familiar canine slumber, or sitting with that unnerving stillness. It was a meticulously crafted postage stamp morning, a perfect tableau of ordinary animal care. But for Jonathan, it was a thin veneer. The angles of the building were sharper, more predatory. The shadows that clung to the corners were no longer mere absence of light. They were deeper, inkier, imbued with a palpable density. He did not see it with his eyes, not precisely, but he felt the faint, lingering trace of moisture on the concrete floor in Kara's kennel, where the woman had stood only hours before. It was a subtle detail, a ghostly residue, but to him it screamed of the impossible. The yesterday's mundane routine, the simple tasks of feeding and cleaning, now pulsed with an underlying anxiety. The apparent tranquility of the dogs was no longer peaceful. It was a profound, chilling waiting. The weak autumn sunlight, filtering through the pines and casting hazy beams into the dusty air of the kennels, did not offer warmth or comfort. Instead, it mercilessly illuminated the countless dust motes swirling in the stale air, each tiny speck shimmering like ash. The remnants of something burned away, something lost. He was barely through the door when he heard his name. Jonathan. The voice was flat even, cutting through the muted sounds of the shelter. It was the owner of the facility, a woman of indeterminate middle age, with that same unnervingly pale skin and the same cold, assessing gaze he had seen in the owners who came to collect the dogs. She emerged from her office, her posture rigid, her presence commanding. Her voice, though level, carried a faint subterranean hum, a low vibration that resonated with the infrasound he had felt from the dogs. She led him into her cramped office, the air in there thick and still. There were no pleasantries, no questions about his unauthorized absence. She sat behind her cluttered desk, her hands clasped, her eyes fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. "You're back," she stated, not asked. Good. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to an inaudible murmur. We don't need employees who are too observant, Jonathan. We don't need people who ask too many questions. Or, more precisely, people who begin to see things they shouldn't. It was not a threat delivered with anger, but with a chilling documentary seriousness, as she read from a rule book stating an incontrovertible fact of nature. He felt dissected, his thoughts and reactions meticulously calculated. She knew. She knew exactly what he had seen, what he had understood. There was no rage in her expression, only a profound understanding and a cool, unwavering disapproval. She was not looking at him as an employee who had broken protocol, but as a variable, an anomaly that had disrupted a precise equation. Her gaze conveyed a clear message. He was something that needed to be removed or assimilated. As he went about his duties that day, moving through the aisles of kennels, he noticed a profound change in the dogs' reactions to him. Before, they had regarded him with either indifference or a mild, canine curiosity. Now, as he passed, their amber eyes followed him. There was no longer contempt or simple disinterest. Their gazes held a strange mixture of question and recognition. By witnessing their secret, he had become part of the secret himself. He was no longer an outsider, a mere caretaker. He was now an initiate, a reluctant participant in their horrifying reality, and they regarded him with the unnerving solemnity of fellow prisoners or fellow beings now tethered to the same inexplicable truth. The metallic smell was everywhere now, not just clinging to the concrete, but on his clothes, on his skin, beneath his fingernails. It was no longer an external odor. It had become an internal one. It was the taste in his mouth, the scent on his breath. It was a marker of his new condition, his unwanted state of knowing. It was the indelible stain of the impossible, a constant, chilling reminder that the world he once knew was gone, and a new, terrifying reality had taken its place, pressing in on him from all sides. He was trapped, utterly and irrevocably, within its cold, metallic embrace. The metallic tang, now an unwelcome and persistent resident in Jonathan Marlowe's nostrils, urged him onward. He knew he was being watched, that every movement was catalogued by the pale woman in the office. But he could not stop. The instinct that had driven him as a United States Marine, the need to collect facts, to document, to find patterns in the chaos, now redirected itself towards this terrifying new enemy. He had to understand. He had to find the logic, the rules of this unspeakable phenomenon. His first foray into active investigation involved his beat-up digital camera, a relic from his pre-shelter life. He waited until the afternoon, when the owner was away in town, gathering supplies or attending to the dark business that occupied her. He moved quickly, quietly, from kennel to kennel, snapping pictures. He focused on the dog's front paws, the ones he now knew were not truly paws. He took close-ups of the scars he had noticed on Kara and now saw on several other animals. Those neat, thin lines on their wrists. The camera's digital lens, with its brutal clarity, did not lie. It magnified the irregularity of the seams, the surgically neatness of the healed skin. He zoomed in further, and what he saw made his stomach churn. Not random injuries, but a series of surgical interventions, faint, imperceptible lines forming a chilling pattern, a deliberate design etched into their flesh. It was a map of procedures, a grotesque anatomical blueprint. That night, instead of driving home, Jonathan slipped into the surrounding woods after dark. He spent hours circling the perimeter of the shelter, moving cautiously through the dense undergrowth, the beam of his small tactical flashlight cutting through the gloom. The chain-link fence, topped with barbed wire, ran along the edge of a marshy section of forest where the ground was perpetually soft and damp. Near an old, dilapidated wooden gate, its hinges rusted solid and its boards rotting, he found them. Tracks. Alongside the heavy, familiar imprints of dog paws, there were other depressions in the thick, wet mud. They were unmistakably barefoot human footprints, but they were wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. The print of the heel was too broad, too blunt. The arch was strangely flattened, and the toes. They were too long, impossibly so, and they splayed out at unnatural angles, a distorted fan of flesh pressed into the muck. It was not quite a dog's paw, and it was not quite a human foot. It was something in between, a monstrous, unsettling transitional form, caught and immortalized in the pliable earth. The sight was a cold spike of horror driven into his chest, the tangible, undeniable fact of the texture of the impossible. He drove into town the next day, not for supplies, but for answers. The small cluster of clapboard houses and faded storefronts was too quiet, eerily so. A pall of stillness hung over the streets. As he walked, he noticed it again. The way people avoided his gaze. Eyes would flick away as he approached. Faces would quickly turn toward shop windows or the distant horizon. No one met his eye. Everyone sensed that something was profoundly wrong, but everyone remained silent. This collective denial, this communal turning away from the obvious, became another layer of the horror, a quiet complicity that was as unsettling as the shapeshifters themselves. Back at his room, Jonathan meticulously reviewed his personal notes on the dog's behavior, the ones he had been making since his first shift. He had jotted down observations about their synchronicity, their unified movements, their collective hum. Now, as he reread them, a new term came to mind: super-synchronization. What he was observing in the shelter dogs went far beyond the natural pack behavior of even highly trained animals. This was a level of coordinated action, a precise, instantaneous mimicry of movement and thought that was simply impossible in the natural world. It was not instinct. It was training, rigorous and relentless, or a far more sinister compulsion and coercion, a deep-seated control that bypassed free will entirely. He made another trip to Dr. Airy's veterinary clinic. This time he went without a dog, armed only with a desperate need for unvarnished truth. The waiting room was empty, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and stale pet fur. Dr. Airy, her eyes still tired, looked up with a start when he entered. He did not mince words. He spoke about the scars, the strange blood, the unsettling quiet. Under his quiet, persistent pressure, a dam broke within her. Her face crumpled. Her shoulders slumped. She confessed, her voice a whisper, that she had been forbidden from running a full blood analysis on any of the shelter animals. They said it was a privacy issue, she mumbled. But that's just a lie, Jonathan. Their blood, it does not match. It is an analog. It is blood-like, but it is not blood. Not like any mammal I've ever seen. It's other. Her eyes were wide with a terror he recognized, a terror that mirrored his own. As he drove back towards the shelter, the last light of the day bleeding across the western sky, a new chilling sensation crept over him. He felt it, a profound and undeniable certainty that he was being watched. Not by one pair of eyes, but by many. The feeling was omnipresent, surrounding him, pressing in from the darkening woods. Eyes in the shadows, eyes in the distant, barely visible hills. They were invisible to him, yet acutely felt, and they were utterly cold. The game had changed. He was no longer just an observer, an employee. He was no longer even just a nuisance. He was now, without a shadow of a doubt, the prey. The escalating tension, thick as the main fog itself, had begun to warp Jonathan Marlowe's perception of reality. The ordinary world, the one with clear lines and definable threats, was dissolving, replaced by a landscape of unsettling suggestions. He started to see reflections in the most unexpected places, fleeting images that confirmed his growing paranoia, twisting his reality into a grotesque funhouse mirror. He walked across the shelter yard, the gravel crunching under his boots, his mind racing through the disparate clues he had gathered. A recent downpour had left puddles in the ruts of the drive, muddy depressions reflecting the dull gray sky. As he passed one particularly dark, murky pool, he glanced down. For a split second, instead of his own haggard reflection, he saw them. A pair of amber eyes, luminous and ancient, staring back from the inky surface. They were gone as quickly as they appeared, vanishing the instant his mind focused. It was a brief, subliminal flicker, but the sharp, acute sensation of presence it left behind was undeniable. A cold breath on the back of his neck. A ceaseless internal monologue had taken root in his mind, a constant argument against the encroaching madness. It was not the terrified whisper of "I'm going insane," but a fierce, desperate resistance. No, they are trying to make me think I'm going insane. It was a war of perceptions, fought on the battlefield of his own consciousness. Every odd smell, every strange sound, every unsettling glance from a dog was an assault, and he had to continually reassert his own sanity against their insidious, reality-bending presence. Determined to gather more concrete evidence, Jonathan acquired a small, voice-activated digital recorder. Late one night, after he had ostensibly finished his shift, he secreted the tiny device deep within Kara's kennel, burying it beneath a fresh pile of straw near the back wall. He returned to his truck, parked a safe distance away, and attempted to sleep, a cold knot of apprehension twisting in his gut. The next morning, retrieving the recorder with trembling fingers, he hurried to his truck and pressed play. The initial minutes were filled with the expected rustling and faint thumps. Then, around the 2-hour mark, a sudden, piercing, high-frequency squeal erupted, cutting through the silence like a knife. It lasted only a few seconds, a sound that bypassed his ears and vibrated directly inside his skull. After that, a chilling polyphony began. It was not barking. It was a chorus of low, guttural mutterings, a strange borborygmus that started as a distorted approximation of human speech, whispered, sibilant sounds he could not decipher, before slowly, inexorably, devolving into a deep, resonant growl, a sound that vibrated with raw, primal power. He quickly turned it off, his hands shaking, the unnatural chorus still echoing in his mind. A few days later, one of the dogs was being transferred to a new owner. Jonathan watched the exchange, his senses heightened, every detail scrutinized. The dog, a medium-sized male with particularly intelligent amber eyes, was visibly distressed, its body hunched in profound submission. But it was the smell that struck Jonathan. The usual scent of earth and wet fur had been replaced by a bitter, acrid smell of fear, a pungent metallic tang of pure animal terror. But mingled with it, faint but distinct, was a sweet, sickly odor he could not place at first. It was clean, cloying, and then it hit him, the scent of baby powder. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. The innocent scent, married to the potent smell of fear, conjured images too disturbing to contemplate. In his desperate attempt to push back against the encroaching darkness, Jonathan consciously began to introduce bright light into his life. At the shelter, he flicked on every overhead lamp, illuminating every nook and cranny. In his small, rented room, he bought extra bulbs, banishing any semblance of gloom. Yet, a terrifying paradox emerged. The more light he shone, the deeper and blacker the shadows became in the corners, clinging to the edges of his vision. Light did not banish them. It merely made them more pronounced, highlighting their oppressive presence. Shadow itself was their habitat, their true medium, and the light merely served to define its terrifying boundaries. He spent his nights hunched over his notes, connecting the disparate threads. The transfers always occurred at night, the scars on the paws, the super-synchronization. And then, a horrifying scheme began to emerge. The dogs with the freshest scars, the ones that still showed faint traces of healing, were invariably the ones that disappeared. And they did so with chilling regularity. Every 7 days. It was a precise, calculated schedule, a horrifying cycle of transformation. 7 days in the animal form, a period of containment and control, followed by the terrifying conversion back to their human-like guise, and then their reintroduction into the wider world, their true purpose unknown. As if to underscore the chilling accuracy of his deductions, Jonathan saw her again. The shelter owner. He was driving through town, his mind lost in a fog of dread, when he saw her emerge from the local general store, a bag of groceries clutched in her pale hands. She did not see him, her gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. For a fleeting moment as she turned her head, her face caught the harsh glare of the street lamp. And in that instant her features shifted. The contours of her face sharpened with startling rapidity, her jawline thickened and hardened, her eyes, though still human-shaped, briefly flaring with an inner, animalistic intensity. It was a momentary, terrifying slip of the mask, a raw, unfiltered glimpse beneath the carefully constructed facade. The illusion of normalcy for Jonathan Marlowe was now utterly, irrevocably shattered. Jonathan Marlowe, now acutely aware that his days as a mere employee at the Last Chance Animal Shelter were severely numbered, knew he had to act. His previous attempts at covert investigation had yielded terrifying truths, but they had not given him the key, the underlying logic that governed this hidden world. He needed more. He needed to find the heart of their operation, the source of their power, the very rules they lived by. He had to find a channel of communication, a way to understand their rationale before he himself became another silent casualty. His target was the owner's office. He waited until late evening, long after the last employee had gone, after the oppressive quiet had settled back over the kennels. He picked the lock with a rudimentary set of tools he had kept from his time in the military, his hands surprisingly steady despite the rapid drumming of his heart. The door clicked open with a soft, imperceptible sigh. He slipped inside, flashlight in hand. The office was small, cluttered, yet strangely impersonal. The air inside was heavy, immobile, as if time itself had slowed, caught in the stale, dusty atmosphere. There were stacks of paperwork, mundane reports, but nothing that screamed of cosmic horror. His flashlight beam swept across the desk, revealing pens, a coffee mug, and a single incongruous item, a block-bound notebook with a stiff, dark cover. It stood out, thrumming with an inexplicable energy. He picked it up, his gloved fingers tracing the worn edges. It was no ordinary ledger. Inside, instead of accounting entries or dog profiles, he found pages filled with meticulously, calligraphically rendered schemes and formulas. They were not in any language he recognized, a bizarre blend of geometric patterns, advanced mathematics, and symbols that were ancient hieroglyphs. But interspersed among them, written in precise, elegant script, were a few English words, chilling in their context. Quantum, entropy of forms, generation of stability, and then columns of complex, untranslatable symbols that coiled and intersected like a venomous script. This was their science, their terrible, cold engineering. He flipped through the pages, his pulse quickening until he reached the last one. There, drawn with stark precision, was a graphic symbol. It was an intricate design, a stylized cat's eye, an almond shape with a vertical slit pupil, all of it enclosed within 7 perfectly concentric circles. The symbol pulsed with a magnetic energy, a silent scream of significance. Jonathan felt an undeniable certainty. This was it. This was the key, the logo, the fundamental sigil of their entire horrifying enterprise. The notebook itself felt wrong. It was heavy, surprisingly so, cold and dense in his hands, like a slab of polished stone rather than paper and cardboard. As he turned the pages, a faint, dry, rustling sound emanated from between the covers, not like the soft whisper of paper, but like the delicate shush of fine sand shifting in a breeze. He realized then that it was not paper at all. It was skin, tanned, prepared, and bound into a terrifying tome. His finger, against his will, reached out and traced the lines of the cat's eye symbol on the final page. The moment his skin made contact, a searing, sharp pain lanced through his right temple, an agonizing pressure that was an ice pick driven into his brain. His vision exploded into a blinding flash of white light, then darkness. In that instant of blinding pain, he saw an image seared directly into his consciousness. An infinite black space, utterly devoid of stars or light, stretching into an endless, terrifying void. And in that void, suspended in the cosmic blackness, were 2 enormous amber eyes, glowing with an ancient, implacable light, each one the size of a farmhouse. They stared at him, into him, through him. Then came the voice. It was not a sound in his ears, but a sensation that vibrated deep within his skull, passing directly through the bone and into the very core of his being. It was cold, vast, and utterly devoid of emotion. "You see," the voice resonated, "now you are connected." The words were not in English, yet he understood them with a terrifying clarity. They bypassed language, bypassing thought. His internal world, the sacred, isolated space of his own consciousness, had been violently breached. He was no longer an island. He was now a node, a receptor, integrated into their terrifying network. He did not take the notebook. He did not take anything. He did not even bother to lock the office door behind him. He stumbled out of the room, into the relative sanity of the kennel aisle, his head pounding, his body trembling uncontrollably. He ran then, fled from the shelter, from the town, from the terrifying knowledge that had just been forced upon him. He was too scared by what he had seen inside himself, the invasive reality that had just been downloaded into his mind. This was no longer just a secret of a few shapeshifters. It was a fundamental structure of the universe, a terrifying, unseen architecture of reality that he, Jonathan Marlowe, had inadvertently hacked into. And now, he was undeniably, irrevocably part of it. The connection was established. The terrifying, nonverbal download from the symbol had irrevocably altered Jonathan Marlowe's inner landscape. The world was no longer simply strange. It was now explicable, horrifyingly so, through a new lens of understanding. He began to comprehend their world, and that world was terrifying in its cold, mathematical logic, a universe of precise biological engineering disguised as myth. The symbol, the stylized cat's eye within the 7 concentric circles, now had a brutal clarity. The 7 circles represented the 7-day cycle of transformation, the precisely calibrated period of containment and regeneration. The eye was not merely a symbol. It was the chilling embodiment of their omnipresent observation and control, an unseen gaze that encompassed all their operations. And the shelter itself, he realized, was more than a farm and a prison. It was an antenna, a massive biological communication channel, tuned to something vast and ancient, a horrifying reality that existed beyond the usual confines of space and time. He understood now that the shape-shifting, the forced transformation into canine form, was not a curse and not a magical trick. It was a brutal biological necessity, a form of protection. The human body, with its fragile biology and limited perceptions, simply could not withstand direct, prolonged contact with the cosmic horror they saw, with the unfathomable energies that pulsed through the universe. The dog form was a buffer, a resilient, durable casing that allowed them to exist on this plane, a low-voltage mode that shielded them from the annihilating truth of their true existence. They were shifting for survival, not for power or malice, to maintain some semblance of form in a reality too vast and terrible to bear. The next day, a new, sickening detail underscored his terrifying epiphany. As Jonathan walked down the main corridor, heading towards the supply closet, his nostrils were assaulted by an unmistakable, acrid smell of blood. It was not the faint metallic tang he had grown accustomed to, the dry, technical scent that permeated the concrete. This was the raw, undeniable odor of fresh, warm human blood, thick and visceral, a smell that turned his stomach. He rounded the corner and saw the owner, her pale face impassive, her back to him. She was moving with a chilling efficiency, a mop and bucket in hand, quickly and meticulously wiping down a section of the concrete floor. There was no doubt in his mind. This was a sacrifice, a necessary price for their continued existence, a gruesome offering to maintain the horrifying balance. He started to see more, not just with his eyes, but with a newly awakened, horrifying perception. He examined the cinder block walls of the kennel. There were no visible cracks, no structural flaws. But now, in the spaces between the bricks, where the mortar should have been solid and inert, he saw them. Thin, transparent threads, faintly iridescent, that pulsed with a low, barely perceptible frequency. They were like the capillaries of a vast, unseen organism, coursing with an invisible energy. The entire shelter, he realized with a shudder, was not merely a building. It was alive. It breathed. As he washed his hands later, scrubbing at the pervasive, metallic scent, he stared into the cracked mirror above the sink. And then he saw it. In the reflection, his own eyes, For a terrifying fraction of a second flared yellow, a brief, unsettling echo of the amber eyes that now haunted his waking hours. It was not a trick of the light, was not a hallucination born of exhaustion and terror. It was real. It was an infection, a transformation beginning at the cellular level, a subtle, insidious change working its way into his very being. He was becoming one of them, not by choice, but by exposure, by knowledge. He found himself gravitating towards Kara's kennel. She watched him, her amber eyes unblinking. He reached through the bars, his hand hesitant. She did not shy away. Instead, she leaned her head against his palm, her broad forehead pressing into his skin. It was a gesture of profound tenderness. Yet beneath it he felt a wave of crushing despair. In that small, silent act, he sensed a sincere desperation and a silent plea. They did not want to be monsters, he realized. They did not want this forced existence, this 7-day cycle of oblivion. But there was no choice. They were trapped, forced into a role by something far greater, far more ancient. And then the ultimate existential horror settled upon him. He understood their purpose. They were not simply shapeshifters. They were guards, sentinels at the gates of perception, protecting humanity from a reality it could not comprehend. They were the watchers at the threshold, maintaining a fragile equilibrium, forced to hide the true face of the universe, a face of incomprehensible geometry and cold alien logic from the unsuspecting masses of humanity. They were the thin, monstrous line between order and annihilating chaos, between sanity and the terrifying infinite void. And he, Jonathan Marlowe, was now one of them, a knowing participant in their terrible eternal watch. The pact was unspoken, yet utterly binding. Jonathan Marlowe stood in the main kennel aisle, the lingering scent of ozone from his last encounter with the owner still prickling in his nostrils, a sharp, metallic reminder of cosmic cold. He was no longer just a witness. He was implicated. He could not ignore what he had seen, what he now understood. And in the logic of this terrifying new world, to run was not merely to escape. It was to die, to be erased, to have his consciousness unmade. The owner was waiting for him. She emerged from her office not with the hurried steps of an administrator, but with a deliberate, processional grace. Her pale face was devoid of anger, devoid of any discernible emotion. Her amber eyes, however, held a chilling certainty. She stopped before him, her presence filling the narrow aisle. "You have seen too much, Jonathan," she stated, her voice flat, calm, a murmur. Her lips barely moved, yet the words resonated with a dreadful weight, as heavy and unyielding as polished lead. She offered him a choice. It was a choice without options, a terrifying forced binary. You accept the rules, continue to work here, and your life will be safe, within the parameters of our purpose. Your alternative is to attempt to leave, to deny what you have seen, and the town, the very world outside these gates, will become too dangerous for you. Your existence will become untenable. Jonathan felt it then, a palpable pressure in the air around him, thick and suffocating. It was not the crude threat of physical death, of a bullet to the brain or a knife in the gut. No, this was far more terrifying. This was the threat of dissolution, of being unmade, of having his consciousness unraveled, his memory purged from the collective mind, his very existence erased from the fabric of reality. If he left, he would not just be killed, he would be deleted, a mere program error in their vast, cold system, efficiently wiped from the universe. His last vestiges of rationalism crumbled. There was no scientific explanation that saved him here, no logic that undid the impossible truths he now carried within him. He was no longer trying to solve a puzzle or unravel a mystery. He was faced with a fundamental existential choice, and in that moment, in the face of absolute terrifying power, he made his decision. It was a moment of profound surrender, a conscious relinquishing of his former life, his former self, his human identity. He met her gaze. His own eyes betrayed none of the profound internal earthquake that was tearing his world apart. "I remain," he said. His voice, to his surprise, was steady, firm, though inside a thin, taut string of his humanity vibrated with an agonizing tremor. To the outside world, to any casual observer, he was simply an employee accepting terms, a man keeping his job. But inside, he was a witness, a convert, and now, irrevocably, a co-conspirator. As she turned to leave, her tall, gaunt figure receding down the corridor, Jonathan noticed one last chilling detail. Her shadow, cast by the harsh fluorescent light on the cinder block wall, did not match her figure. It was wider, more angular, its outlines subtly distorted. And from its base, stretching across the concrete floor like a dark, insubstantial current, was a form, a too long and impossibly subtle tale. It was a fleeting glimpse of the true form beneath the human facade, a final, silent confirmation of the monstrous reality he had chosen to embrace. After she disappeared back into her office, the air in the corridor shimmered with a peculiar after-effect. A distinct, ozone-like smell lingered, sharp and metallic, like the tang of the air after a fierce lightning strike. As Jonathan now understood, the residual scent left after contact with something too distant and too cold for human comprehension. It was the smell of the void, the smell of cosmic machinery, the smell of his new, horrifying reality. He was in, truly in, and the chilling, vast emptiness of their purpose now stretched before him. Jonathan Marlowe stayed. He clocked in, performed his duties, and navigated the uncanny quiet of the last chance animal shelter. But he was no longer merely a human, a bewildered employee observing the impossible. He had, by accepting his fate, begun to play by their rules, not as a subjugated slave, but as an unwilling initiate, a reluctant, dedicated member of their strange, terrifying order. His transformation, initiated by that symbol, that forced connection, continued subtly, insidiously, a creeping, irreversible change. His perception had altered, subtly but profoundly. The world, particularly within the walls of the shelter, now pulsed with a hidden energy. He began to see the faint, imperceptible pulsation in the thick, dark fur of the dogs, like blood coursing just beneath the surface, or currents of an unknown energy flowing through them. In their amber eyes he could now discern faint internal shimmers, minute shifts of color and light that spoke of depths he could not grasp. And the infrasound, that low, chest-vibrating hum he had once only vaguely felt, he could now hear it, a constant, resonant thrumming that emanated from the very fabric of the building, a silent, pervasive language. One afternoon, while meticulously cleaning a kennel, scrubbing the concrete with practiced, methodical strokes, he experienced something new and profoundly unsettling. As his hand brushed against the flank of a sleeping dog, he felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of crushing weariness and profound loneliness wash over him, as clear and distinct as his own emotion. It was not a flicker of empathy, not a sympathetic response. It was a direct transmission of sensation, a raw, unfiltered emotional data stream, passing directly from the animal's mind to his own. He paused, his heart pounding, overwhelmed by the sheer, desolate weight of it. They were not just physical beings. They were connected, a network of suffering and endurance. He found himself drawn to Kara. Her amber eyes met his with a new, quiet understanding. He reached into her cage, his hand tentative, and slowly, deliberately, began to stroke her fur. The dense, dark coat, which had once felt alien and disturbingly warm, was now familiar beneath his touch. A strange comfort. The heat radiating from her body was no longer unsettling. It was a deep, pervasive warmth that drew him in, enveloped him. And the faint, ever-present smell of metal that emanated from her fur, once a source of terror, now calmed him. A strange, reassuring scent that spoke of shared existence, shared secret. That night, he had a dream. Not a vivid, colorful dream, but a dry, gray vision that felt more like a memory than a nocturnal fantasy. He was adrift in cosmos, not a starry, familiar space, but an empty, vast expanse devoid of light and warmth. It was filled with colossal, perfectly rendered geometric figures, impossible, crystalline structures that moved with a silent, terrible grace, following a logic that was utterly incorrect, alien to any human understanding. The dream left him with a profound fear not of chaos, but of a chilling, absolute order, a precise, mathematical universe that dwarfed and rendered meaningless all human life. The number 7 began to haunt him, appearing everywhere with an unnerving regularity. He saw 7 flickering fluorescent lamps in the main corridor. He counted 7 thick steel bars on the front of Kara's cage. He noticed that one of the more frequently visiting owners had a name that contained exactly 7 letters. The number resonated within him, a subtle but insistent hum in his awareness. It was more than a number. It was a frequency, a resonance that echoed the cycle of transformation, the very rhythm of their existence. The dog's behavior towards him continued to shift. They no longer regarded him with indifference or even the cold recognition of an initiate. Now, when he walked by, they did not simply look. They followed his every movement with their amber eyes, their powerful bodies held in a state of alert anticipation. It was not subservience. It was the watchful waiting of soldiers awaiting orders, a quiet, palpable expectation. They were not merely dogs in a kennel. They were a pack, and he, Jonathan Marlowe, was now unequivocally part of it. He caught his reflection in the water trough, and later in the grimy mirror of the washroom. His eyes were still his own, a tired blue-gray. But the sensation of an internal change persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. He felt a new, profound density within his bones, a solidness that was new to him. His limbs felt heavier, his muscles tighter, more coiled, and the smell of metal, that pervasive, acrid tang, was no longer merely clinging to him. It was emanating from him, a subtle but undeniable part of his own physical being. It was his own smell now. He was changing slowly, irrevocably, becoming what he had witnessed, a creature suspended between worlds, awaiting the inevitable. The story had reached its terrible, inevitable completion. Jonathan Marlowe walked the long, gray corridor of the Last Chance Animal Shelter, no longer a man consumed by dread, but a being defined by it. He had accepted his fate, internalized it, and in doing so, he had finally understood the cold, mathematical logic of this small, hidden world. He heard them then, the familiar, heavy footsteps of the owner echoing from the distant office, deliberate and unhurried. This time, Jonathan did not duck into a kennel, did not feign work, did not hide. He simply stopped, turning to face her, and waited. His posture was calm, his breathing steady. He was ready. She emerged into the main aisle, her tall, gaunt figure pausing before him. Her amber eyes, once cold with suspicion and disapproval, now regarded him with a profound, ancient pride. There was no warmth, no affection in that gaze, only a chilling, silent confirmation of his transition, a recognition of his complete assimilation. She had waited for this. She spoke then, her voice low, flat, carrying the same subterranean hum he now perceived in everything. It was the phrase he had, in the depths of his transformed being, been waiting to hear. "Your cycle will begin soon, Jonathan. Be ready for the shift." The words were a pronouncement, a cold, unyielding prophecy. Cycle. Shift. He understood. It was time for his own transformation. In that terrifying moment, a stark, brutal contrast assaulted his senses. Through the grimy window at the end of the corridor, the world outside stretched into a sunny, ordinary autumn day. He could see a distant patch of green where children, miniature figures of oblivious innocence, were laughing, their voices faint, carried on a gentle breeze. Life went on, banal and beautiful, utterly unaware of the cosmic horror unfolding mere feet away. This jarring juxtaposition, the stark reality of the mundane against the cosmic terror, was an unbearable cruelty. He understood the true, terrifying scale of it now. They had been here for decades and centuries. They had always been here. This humble, nondescript shelter in Maine was not an isolated anomaly. It was a single node in a vast, interconnected network of similar facilities that spanned the entire world. This was a meticulously crafted structure, a silent army, a perpetual defensive perimeter shielding human civilization from the incomprehensible, annihilating infinity that lay beyond their fragile reality. They were the buffer, the last line of defense, and he was one of them. Jonathan Marlowe ran a hand along the thick steel bars of Kara's kennel, feeling the familiar, smooth coldness of the metal. He felt the subtle, nascent heaviness of his new body, the growing density in his bones. He had not merely accepted his fate. He had embraced his role. He was a buffer, a soldier in this secret, unending war of forms, a silent guardian against an unknowable darkness. His humanity, what remained of it, was a fading memory, a warm, distant dream. He looked at the dogs. They looked at him. Their gazes were amber, luminous, unified, devoid of individual thought, burning with a collective purpose. They no longer regarded him as an outsider, an employee, a frightened human. They saw him now as a member of the pack, one of their own, transformed and ready. And in their unwavering, synchronized anticipation, a silent, terrible waiting for the command that would initiate his own terrifying metamorphosis, lay the ultimate horror. Jonathan Marlowe understood, and the silence of the shelter, no longer merely unnerving, became the profound, eternal whisper of his doom.